OG Fact Checker, here to give you a juicy tidbit of history that's verified. I had my subject for this episode lined up after I stumbled across a juicy tidbit that made me giddy. Well, 3 tidbits actually. If you watched episode 15, One Arm, no problem, you saw the first one, Horace Pippin. This is the second one, a golden child of the Harlem Renaissance who rubbed elbows with W.E.B. Du Bois and was good friends with all the literary intelligentsia and visual artists of the time, like Augusta Savage, Ralph Ellison, Jacob Lawrence, and William H. Johnson. If you haven't already guessed, the person I'm talking about is Romare Bearden, the artist who made everyone look at collages differently. The source I'll use for this episode is An American Odyssey, The Life and Work of Romare Bearden, written by Mary Schmidt Campbell, published in 2018. This U.S. Army veteran was once offered a Major League Baseball contract if he agreed to pass as a white man. But as much as Bearden loved baseball, he refused to deny his Black identity, so he turned his attention to art, creating cartoons for newspapers and magazines before transitioning to painting, and then to his coveted collages, which is why the title of this episode is The Passionate Pitcher Who Liked to Paint Pictures. Say that 3 times real fast, I dare you. To understand Fred Howard Romare Bearden, known as Romy to his family, you have to look at his upbringing. Bearden was born in September 1911 to an affluent family in Charlotte, North Carolina. His paternal great-grandfather was a prosperous business and landowner in Charlotte before the stock market crash left the family destitute. Bearden shuttled between Harlem and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania as a child, thanks to his mother, Bessie, who had lived there for a time. From a prosperous Black family in her own right, Bessie could pass for a white woman. Some thought she was Latin or Middle Eastern, but Bessie, like her son, refused to pass for anything but Black, though she wouldn't hesitate to play the advantage her light skin provided. Bessie met Howard, Bearden's father, in Atlantic City while she was staying there with a prominent Black family. She was a social butterfly, the it girl in Black society circles. She was charming, intelligent, woke for her time, and ambitious. After they married, the couple stayed with Bearden's paternal grandparents in Charlotte in the house where Bearden was born. But feeling the oppression of Jim Crow laws that included a curfew for Blacks, the increase of vigilantism by the Ku Klux Klan, legislation that kept the status quo of white superiority, and movies such as D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation drove the family up north to Hell's Kitchen before migrating up to Harlem in New York City. Bearden was 4 years old at the time. It wasn't easy at first for the little family. Bessie and Howard moved around a lot and oftentimes had to leave Bearden with relatives in Charlotte, Pittsburgh, and Harlem. Howard found work on the railroad until World War I broke out. He was drafted, but he left the U.S. in 1917 for Canada. Bessie and her son joined Howard, and they lived in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, where Bessie worked for a bank while Howard worked for the railroad. They returned to the U.S. after the war ended in 1918 and resettled in Harlem with an 8-year-old Bearden. Bearden was seen as a gifted child. At the end of 6th grade, he was advanced to 8th grade. Though it's not clear why, Bearden returned to Pittsburgh, staying with his maternal grandparents who owned and ran a boarding house for Black steel workers. This exposure to Southern Blacks who migrated north for work would inspire his art. When he returned to Harlem sometime in 1922, his mother had reclaimed her place in Black society and in New York City politics, becoming the first woman and first Black woman to be elected to New York City School Board Number 15. In 1924, she was elected president of the National Colored Women's Democratic League, an organization with the goal of registering women to vote. Also by this time, Howard stopped working for the railroad and began a civil service job with the city. Bessie, who Bearden affectionately called my drill sergeant, often held salons that exposed him to historic figures such as Mary McLeod Bethune, Paul Robeson, Marcus Garvey, County Cullen, Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes, Garcia Lorca, and Fats Waller. In 1925, Bearden lost his grandmother and great-grandmother the same year he started DeWitt Clinton High School, originally an all-boys school located in the Bronx. This school has an impressive list of alumni. It was named after New York Senator DeWitt Clinton, who played a role in the construction of the Erie Canal, opened in 1897 and didn't become co-ed until 1983. I know I'm going off topic again, but I gotta mention some of the alumni because there is a pretty long list of notable people who graduated from this school. So we have poets County Cullen and Gil Scott Heron, directors George Cukor, Stanley Kramer, and Gary Marshall, writers James Baldwin, Richard Condon, and Avery Corman, playwrights Neil Simon and Patty Chayefsky, actors Don Adams, Alan Arbus, Martin Balsam, Burt Lancaster, Larry Storch, and Judd Hirsch. In politics, there's U.S. Congressman Charles Charlie Rangel, and as far as creators go, I saw on the list Stan Lee, Bob Kane, Bernard Herrmann, Sherwood Schwartz, and Abe Mirapole, a teacher. Why am I mentioning Abel Mirapole? Well, he was the lyricist who wrote Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit. Pretty groovy, ain't it? The rigorous academics at DeWitt Clinton should have held the attention of Bearden, a person who skipped 2 grades in middle school. But it didn't, and he begged his parents to let him finish his last 2 years of high school at Peabody High School in Pittsburgh, staying with his grandparents, who by then had moved out of the boarding house. He began drawing, something he was introduced to by a childhood friend who died unexpectedly. His grandmother encouraged him to enter a poster contest, and with her advice, he won that prize and a second one. Bearden explored athletics as well. He threw the discus and ran on the track team. Even though his greatest love was baseball as a talented pitcher, he preferred to play on sandlots, turning down an invitation to join his school's baseball team. He would reverse this preference once he entered college. Starting as a pre-med student at Lincoln University, the year the stock market crashed in 1929, he would transfer universities twice. First to the art department at Boston University in 1930, focusing on being a cartoonist before his final transfer to New York University in 1932 as an art education major, where he graduated in June 1935. He builds his profile as a cartoonist with school publications and W.E.B. Du Bois' publication, Crisis. While at Boston University, Bearden indulged in his other love, varsity baseball, as a pitcher for the Boston Colored Tigers, the most well-known and respected team in the Negro Leagues. One summer, after playing an exhibition game for the university against the Philadelphia Athletics, the team's owner offered Bearden a contract, but only if Bearden agreed to pass as a white man. Bearden refused. Regardless of his skin tone, he would never deny his Black heritage, following the path of his white-passing mother. The following summer, a thumb injury sidelined his pitching career permanently. Bearden would meet many people who would influence his style and approach, and the first one to do so was George Grotz, a German political cartoonist who was stripped of his German citizenship by the National Socialist government for exposing corruption in Germany. Though his English was limited, he managed to mentor and instruct Bearden, encouraging him to observe the world with eyes unfiltered by prevailing opinions. He introduced Bearden to drawing with a live model, and to painters Francisco Goya and Honoré Daumier. Their relationship was brief, but the impact to Bearden was long-lasting. Bearden's first essay, which shook the art world, was titled The Negro Artist and Modern Art. It was published in December 1934 issue of Opportunity, an academic publication by and for African Americans. His essay expressed his ire at the William H. Harmon Foundation, a philanthropic organization that was a major sponsor for Black artists during the Harlem Renaissance. I would say Bearden's major beef with the foundation was that it didn't encourage Black artists to find their own aesthetic, and he chided Black artists sponsored by the foundation for catering to that patronage, like his more successful contemporary, William H. Johnson, who often painted European subject matter. Plus, Bearden felt that Black artists were simply copying each other, that some lacked vision, and that their art should reflect the world around them. He was a huge admirer of Mexican painter Diego Rivera and his murals depicting Mexican life that also served as a political statement. He mentioned Rivera's work as an example of what Black artists should be doing. Bearden's call to arms for Black artists coincided with Roosevelt's push to get Americans working again through the New Deal, or more specifically, through the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, and its Federal Arts Project, or FAP, established in 1935. Dozens of Black artists applied for and was accepted into the FAP, but Bearden wasn't one of them. He graduated from NYU and immediately found work as a social worker. His income plus living with his working parents made him ineligible for the program. But this didn't stop him from political cartoon work for Crisis Monthly and for Baltimore Afro-American Weekly, where the recurring theme of anti-lynching would show up in his work. He continued to paint during the Depression era, his art reflecting the philosophy in his essay. He depicted the life around him, especially as a social worker who regularly conducted home visits of those on public assistance in dilapidated tenements, witnessing poverty up close daily. By 1940, Bearden had created enough paintings to have his first solo show at a gallery in Harlem. A pamphlet that accompanied his show had the following quote from his 1935 essay: "I believe the function of an artist is to find ways of communicating, in sensible, sensual terms, those experiences that do not find adequate expression in the daily round of living, and for which, therefore, no ready-made means of communication exists." Groats exposed Bearden to photomontage and modernism and its potential to disrupt, as well as Dada, an anti-war art movement that began after World War I. The goal of this movement was to destroy traditional values in art and to create a new art to replace the old. The favorable response to this first show was the catalyst for him to move out of his parents' house and into his own studio above the Apollo Theater, which he got with the help of Bessie. But even in his new space, free to create without distractions, Bearden was restless. With this new knowledge, he began questioning representation and race in art. He witnessed the growing unrest by Black artists who were part of WPA and felt restricted by the realism theme WPA preferred. Plus, politics was slowly creeping in as the newly created Un-American Activities Committee began exerting influence in an effort to stomp out alleged communists and other un-American activities. First on their list was the Federal Theater Project, which was forced to close after 4 years in 1939. Next, they came after the visual artists by opening an investigation on the outspoken director of the successful Harlem Cultural Arts Center, Gwendolyn Bennett. The 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor pushed the U.S. into World War II, and though Bearden may have been grappling with representation and race in art, he had no reservations about fighting for his country. He enlisted in the U.S. Army in April 1942. He was assigned to 1st Headquarters, 15th Regiment, 372nd Infantry Division, the same all-black regiment Horace Pippin served in, the Harlem Hellfighters. After World War I, this regiment was sent to China for 26 years, an unusually long time for a deployment. This infantry unit once again saw heavy combat overseas and was well decorated, but Bearden doesn't see any combat. He served stateside, transferring to duty stations across the country. While on leave, he painted at his studio in Harlem, glad to escape a segregated army while mourning the loss of his drill sergeant mother, Bessie, who passed away in 1943. Months after his mother's death, while on leave, William H. Johnson brings a visitor to Bearden's studio, Caress Crosby. Crosby, born Mary Phelps Jacobs, was a wealthy patron and book publisher who, at the age of 19, invented and patented the backless bra before selling the patent to the Warner Brothers Company for $1,500. Always on the lookout for good talent, she opened an art gallery in 1941 when she moved to Washington, D.C. after her husband died. Near DuPont Circle, the G Place Gallery hosted Bearden's solo exhibition while still in the Army, his second exhibition in 4 years. At this show, Bearden sort of previews a shift in his approach to art, embracing elements of Cubism to create racially neutral subjects. Crosby's motherly attention and persistent efforts at marketing his work is welcomed by Bearden, especially after his mother's recent passing. So as Bearden was getting transferred from base to base, he stayed in contact with Crosby, apologizing for the disruptions, but also describing his idea for a new series of paintings titled Passion of Christ. He completed the paintings while stationed in Pine Camp, New York, and had them delivered to the G Place Gallery. Bearden was excited about this series, but the deterioration of his father's mental health after Bessie's death in 1943 forced him to hire a nurse to care for his father, who had taken a leave of absence from his city job. Knowing that his father was not going to get any better, Bearden asked the Army for an early discharge, which was eventually granted. He returned to being a caseworker, moved in with his father as his caretaker, and continued painting. Crosby, forever in Bearden's corner, introduced his work to Samuel Kutz, a former lawyer turned art gallery owner who had a stable of artists who he believed were some of the pioneers of a distinctly American brand of modernism. Some of the painters in Kutz's stable were Robert Motherwell, Adolph Gottlieb, Carl Hotley, and Byron Brown. Hotley, after seeing Bearden's work and without having met him, encouraged Kutz to add Bearden as an artist, which he did by inviting him to exhibit at his new gallery in New York in fall of 1945. Bearden stayed with the Kutz Gallery from 1945 to 1948, and during this period, Bearden would write another condemnation against the art world titled The Negro Artist's Dilemma, an essay published in November 1946. Without getting too lost in the sauce, I'll say that this essay was about shedding the labels that held back Black artists. It's about nonconformity to the stereotypes that have been shamelessly perpetuated in the art world, not only by white artists like Eastman Johnson, but by Black artists as well, because it restrains Black artists in creativity and subject matter. Bearden argued the art world and Black artists need to stop using the term Negro artist and stop assessing a painting based on the race of the artist. Just focus on the art. This sentiment has been echoed repeatedly by other scholars, but at the time of publication, Bearden's essay barely made a ripple. Bearden maintained contact with artist Carl Hotley after the messy split from the Kutz Gallery. Holtley successfully recovered from being dropped by the gallery, and he strongly advised Bearden to travel to Paris for inspiration. Taking a leave of absence from his job and arranging special care for his father, Bearden applied to the Sorbonne, using his GI Bill for the tuition while applying for a Fulbright fellowship to hopefully continue his studies. Armed with letters of introduction, Bearden stayed in Paris for 5 months in 1950, attending classes, visiting endless museums and galleries, meeting Pablo Picasso and other influential artists, and socializing with writers like James Baldwin and Richard Wright. Writer Victor Hugo once lived across the street from where he stayed. He traveled through France into Italy to experience the Italian masters firsthand. He was free from the burdens of his job, from being caretaker, and he could finally focus on his art. When he returned to the U.S., he received notification that his Fulbright application was rejected. He appealed the decision because he was desperate to return to France, but was unsuccessful. From that time on, his only goal was to earn enough money to get back to France, until he met the woman that would change his life in 1953, Nanette Rohan, a former model 13 years his junior, with family from French St. Martin. Just one look was all it took, and the two married a year later. Nanette would introduce him to a former model friend of hers named Laura Baron, who had recently opened an art gallery. Baron would host a Bearden exhibit in 1955, his first one since his break from the Kutz Gallery in 1948. The pressure of being a husband, caregiver, and social worker while trying to paint and pursue songwriting took its toll on his health, and he had a nervous breakdown around 1956 and was temporarily admitted into Bellevue Hospital. After his discharge, Nanette, who believed all the people dropping in and the drugs he was taking with his musician acquaintances were the reasons for Bearden's breakdown, took charge. She eliminated all substances from the home and moved them from their apartment on Morningside Drive to an apartment on Canal Street. This move allowed Bearden to only focus on his painting. The 1960s treated Bearden a little better, with the exception of his father's death at the beginning of the decade, a death that was expected as Howard's health had been on the decline for a while. The following year, he returned to France and Italy, this time with Nanette. She found the experience thrilling, but Bearden was less enthusiastic. The Paris he knew was replaced with a city that, in his mind, had lost its romance. Even though it would be another 3 years before Bearden has another show, he was actively collaborating with other artists who are now using their art to make political statements as the fight for civil rights takes hold of the 1960s. And as his name became popular among young artists, he took on a role his mother once held during the Harlem Renaissance, an advocate for artists. He located exhibition spaces and organized large-scale events. His exposure to these new artists reminded him of the versatility of collages, which by now had a resurgence as an art form. He started experimenting with photographs, magazine cutouts, and colored paper. The Spiral Group, a collective of Black artists, started in 1963, but the origins are not exactly clear. What is clear is that Bearden and a small group got together one night for the purpose of discussing the commitment of the Negro artist in the present struggle for civil liberties, and this meeting evolved into the Spiral Group, which eventually expanded to 15 artists, 14 men, and one woman, painter and printmaker Emma Amos. Bearden, during group meetings, often tried to get members to do collaborative work, once bringing a bag of photographs with cuttings of faces, trees, and commercial objects out of Nanette's ladies' magazines, the national news magazines Life and Look, Black magazines like Ebony, and an African art journal. But no one was interested in collaborative work. This lack of interest didn't stop Bearden from continuing to experiment, contributing for a charity auction his first public display of his collage work using his Bag O photographs titled The Evening Meal of Prophet Peterson. One day, his new art dealer, Arnie Ekstrom, stopped by his studio to discuss Bearden's upcoming show scheduled for the fall of 1964. Unimpressed by the oil paintings, Ekstrom spotted something interesting rolled up in the corner of the studio. Ekstrom asked him about it, but Bearden dismissed it as something he was still working on. It was a billboard sized black and white photograph of one of his collages, and Ekstrom immediately spotted it as the next newest thing on the art scene. Ekstrom suggested titling the series Projections. The Projections exhibition was a smash hit, and it brought him back into the spotlight and established him as the premier collage artist. Successive shows were equally successful. He was commissioned for the cover of Fortune and Time magazines in 1968, and he received a retrospective of his 30-year career at the Museum of Modern Art in 1971. In 1987, Bearden was awarded the National Medal of the Arts from President Ronald Reagan, and everyone noticed the dramatic physical change in his appearance. The untreated aches and pains he had been experiencing for over a year was eventually diagnosed as bone cancer. He died on March 12, 1987, after a stroke. He was 75 years old. And thus ends the story of the passionate pitcher who liked to paint pictures. I love history. You came for the truth. Thank you for staying for the story.